All right, so thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm really grateful for it. I want to thank, first of all, Father Alan Fitzgerald and Dr. James Wetzel of the Augustinian Institute for inviting me to come here this semester. It's been really a gift to be able to have time to spend in study and research, and also time spent in conversation with so many interesting folks here. So I'm really grateful to them for that opportunity. I'm grateful as well to Dr. Barbara Wall, the Vice President for Mission and Ministry, whose office oversees the Augustinian Institute and supports this fellowship. And I'm grateful to Patricia Imbesi, whose generosity to Villanova makes this Imbesi fellowship possible. I also want to say a word of thanks to the many folks who have extended hospitality in various forms to me while I've been here this semester. Anna Misticoni, also in the Augustinian Institute, has been just a wonderful hostess. And there have been lots of folks, Dr. Mark Schiffman, many folks from humanities, from ACS, philosophy and theology, who have welcomed me here. Of course, I'm also grateful to my colleagues at the University of St. Thomas who gave me some time off to be here. They would have been here today, but they're still under 3 feet of snow and couldn't make it. So I want to begin by giving you a few words from T.S. Eliot that I'm not going to talk about in the context of my remarks, but that I think provide a kind of nice poetic description of what Augustine is trying to do and what I'm going to talk about in what follows. So just keep them in mind as we go on, even though I won't make reference to them again much. This is from 4 Quartets, Bert Norton. Words move, music moves only in time, but that which is only living can only die. Words after speech reach into the silence. So it's a pleasure to speak about Augustine at Villanova, where he is so well known, where he is looked to as a source for wisdom and as a friend. I admire and share the conviction of those who believe that Augustine saw so deeply into the human psyche and human experience that his writings continue to give us insight into who we are and who God is. One thing you students of Augustine know is that he's famous for his confessions of sin, of faith, and of praise. And since I know Dr. Wall personally ensures each of you reads that book during your time here, I'm pretty sure you all know, as I do, that text is, among other things, a story of Augustine's loves and failures of love. For his mother, for friends, for his partner of many years, eventually, yes, even for his father, and for his son. Again and again, Augustine confesses his love for and his intimacy with created beauties. But why talk about intimacy and love in a specifically confessional context? What's being confessed? Well, one answer comes quickly to mind, of course. Augustine is a man of God with a notorious sexual past, although we all know it's a little trumped up. It's not as juicy as we were led to believe. And it's not hard to imagine that this great saint might offer his confessions as a disavowal of his penchant for noticing the beauties of the created order, especially the beauties of women and certain kinds of pleasures. And yet you all know, as well as I do, that's not precisely the story Augustine tells, though more than once it's the story that's been told about Augustine, that he never shakes his old Manichaean habit of trying to flee the so-called degradation of incarnate life. I should probably say I'm not turning this into a talk about sex. I promised you death, and we're going to get to death, but there has to be some sex at the beginning. Maybe I should have put that on the poster. Augustine's vulnerability to created beauties is prodigiously confessed. I should say, I want you to pay attention to this phrase, Augustine's vulnerability to created beauties. Those of you who are taking notes might want to write this down. He's vulnerable to created beauties. That is, he notices them, yes, but he's seduced by them, and also he's more than once wounded by them, and sometimes wounded by his love of them. So hold on to that phrase. Augustine's vulnerability to created beauties is prodigiously confessed. And what I hope to do with you in the next 40 minutes is to think about the ambiguous nature of that confession. That confession of vulnerability, so easily and so often read as a confession of sin, is arguably also a confession of faith and praise, as I hope to show you. The categories bleed and blur. Having made his own acknowledgement of his entanglement in loves, Augustine poses for us a version of this question. What kind of love for created beauties does God want from us? Can love of God and love of created beauties make a life together? This question cuts deepest for Augustine when he experiences the deaths of those he loves, his friend, his mom, and his son. In the aftermath of loss, Augustine struggled to align his affections with God's own, or with what he imagined God's affections to be. Or I should say, Augustine tried to align his affections with God's own sometimes, but sometimes not, or at least not right away. Sometimes something in Augustine resisted that alignment, and I hope to show you how and why. The personal struggle packs a theological punch on Augustine's telling. Throughout the Confessions, Augustine wrestles with the question, can you love a God who lets you lose what you love? The answer is yes, of course, but Augustine only grows into that answer as he deepens his intelligence for God's heart. And so the personal question is answered in tandem with another question. We might call it a more strictly theological version of the question. What kind of God weaves beauty and fragility together so closely? So let me just briefly sketch where we're going. What I'm trying to think with you about today is different ways of responding to this close conjunction of beauty and fragility. And I'm going to talk about at least 3 different ways, although they're all sort of mixed up in the stories I tell, so I want to just highlight them for you here. The first way of responding to that tight relation is to think that I should have chosen a more stable object of love. So I loved something that was frail and was lost. Maybe I should have loved something that was a little more stable, like justice or God. The second way we might respond to that tight relation is to be frustrated with a God who seems less enthralled than I am with some created beauty. So I think that I've noticed some beauty, but I think that God hasn't really noticed that beauty. And a third way of responding to the tight conjunction of beauty and fragility is to fear that is to realize after the fact that my love was more flawed than I imagined. So I might start to worry that I didn't even appreciate the beauty that I thought I had initially noticed. So to answer these questions, can you love a God who lets you lose what you love? And what kind of God weaves beauty and fragility together so intimately? We're looking at 5 scenes from Augustine's life. I'm going to begin with a prelude to set the tone, a short study of intimacy and affections within books 7 and 8, guided by 2 readers of Augustine who insist on reading the Confessions as confession. From there, I turn to 3 more passages from Augustine's autobiography, Augustine's book 4 Confessions about his friendship with a young man taken early from life, his book 9 Confessions about the events surrounding his mother Monica's passing from this life, and his earlier work De Magistro. Each of these last 3 scenes includes parting words, or words spoken just before death. Each scene also dramatizes the difficulty of squaring an awareness of human mortality with the hope of remaining close to loved ones. Attention to these poignant conversations sheds light on Augustine's vision of the blessed life, a form of intimacy that cannot be undone despite the passing of created beauties. Parting for Augustine comes to mean not merely heartbreaking loss, but articulation, an articulation which gives shape to the meanings of the life Augustine shares with others. My aim is to demonstrate how Augustine's memories of intimacy and alienation in his closest relationships inform his sense of who God is and what God cares about. Sometimes Augustine finds a memory of intimacy holds him back from the embrace of an incomplete conception of God. Sometimes he finds a memory reminds him of God's love for him, and sometimes both. Augustine's vulnerability to created beauties is unsparingly confessed. Confessed, too, is Augustine's perplexity over the question he wrestles with for many years, a question he puts to us, his readers, as well. What would it take to trust that the good we love derives from God? So, a prelude, intimacy and its discontents. In a 2009 essay titled Consuetudo Carnalis in Augustine's Confessions, Confessing Identity Belonging to Difference, Kathleen Scarrett's insistence on reading Augustine's Book 7 Vision of God as confession bears fruit in the form of a subtle meditation on Augustine's search for intimacy. So you all remember what's going on in Book 7, or let me remind you if it's been a couple years. Augustine in Book 7 makes an inward ascent. He reads the books of some Neoplatonists. He makes this inward ascent, and what he has there is a vision of an immaterial God. There, in that vision, he sees light, he sees truth, and he sees love, though he admits he sees all this from afar in a realm of unlikeness, a regio dissimilitudinus. In the midst of this dazzlingly beautiful vision of an immaterial God, Augustine confesses he is pulled back down to earth by his own weight, the weight of what he terms his consuetudo carnalis, his carnal habit. God's beauty draws him, but he is struck back. So what's Augustine confessing here? That even a vision of God is no match for his sex drive? That he needs to bulk up his willpower so he won't be drawn by the bodies of mere mortals? That the chief obstacle to loving God and sharing in his life is Augustine's old deluder body, a persistent drag on his transcendent aspirations? Well, Skerritt suspects that to end explanation there is to oversimplify and to miss the greater offering of Augustine's insight. This abrupt return to earth was precipitated not just by physical compulsiveness, Skerritt suggests, but by, quote, the memory of an intimate belonging that seemed to drag most heavily when he aspired to embrace an immaterial God, end quote. Sexual intimacy wasn't, for Augustine, just a disastrous nothingness, but also a real good, broken and impartial though it was, and a reminder of what it means to be a soul in time and flesh. Augustine's embrace of an immaterial God generates what Skerritt calls a counterweight awareness of his own incarnation, a reminder that he is a being who can be overtaken by desire, by memory, by grief, a reminder that he is a being who is beholden with living flesh that can't simply be reduced into free will or bare intellect. In the very moment then when Augustine is desperate to know God, he is reminded of another knowledge, that knowledge to which the first man gestures when he exclaims the woman is bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. That reminder destabilizes the vision because it is a reminder of the partiality of the knowledge gained. An eternal, airless hookup is less intimate than it appears. If Skerritt is correct, Book 7 is not an indictment of human embodiment and temporal entanglements, but a reminder that we cannot get close to God simply by distancing ourselves from what tugs at our heartstrings. What Skerritt hears in Augustine's Confessions is an acknowledgement of an attempt to get close to God in a way that misses the meaning of intimacy. It's an intimacy only half guessed, a God only half understood. So Skerritt reads Augustine's words as an acknowledgement that sin may be more expressive of our longing for God than we are inclined to admit. Skerritt's Augustine tells us not merely that the embrace didn't hold then, but arguably that it shouldn't. In an article, Body Double, St. Augustine and the Sexualized Will, James Wetzel offers the complementary suggestion that a key metaphor for Book 7 is that of a womb. When Augustine turns inward, as I said, he finds himself in a place of unlikeness. There, Wetzel writes, quote, he is unlike God, who is presumptively spirit, and unlike the created order, which is presumptively material. In that place of unlikeness, Augustine hears God's voice from on high, and this is Jim's translation because it's good. I am the food of grown-ups. Grow and you will be feeding on me, but you will not change me into you like the food your flesh eats. You will be changed into me. Wetzel suggests there are two kinds of feeding that change the feeder into food. One, a form of starvation, where the body feeds upon itself. Or two, a gestation, a feeding from within the womb. And Wetzel opts for the image of a soul's gestation. God tells Augustine he is still gestating in God and needs to be born, to acknowledge the fact of his incarnation as a son of the living God. The intimacy of gestating mother and unborn child is not meant to hold, not in the same form. A parting comes, and that parting means not just loss, but differentiation, articulation, and maturation. No child grows up inside the womb. The way out is the way to life, though the parting may feel like death for both of them. Those of you who have given birth will know what I'm talking about. Skerritt doesn't extend her analysis beyond Book 7, but Wetzel does in his book Augustine, A Guide for the Perplexed. His reading of Book 8 maintains attention to the familial and natal contexts of Augustine's struggle to put on Christ, or to want to do so. In Book 8, Wetzel suggests Augustine is given not the willpower of Christ, a power that might give him perfect mastery over an unruly body, but instead memories of those in his life who have figured for him the love his heavenly Father has unceasingly poured out upon him. Wetzel cites two examples of this. The first comes when Augustine recalls his unnamed partner under the figure of what he calls Lady Continence. Then he begins to think of continence no longer as a bare power of self-mastery, but as a form of connection with the woman he loves. The second comes when the voice of a child from over the garden wall perhaps prompted Augustine to remember his own fatherly love, as well as Christ's own need for parenting. That willingness to cast himself on the love of a parent is precisely what Augustine needs, and in both cases, Wetzel shows, a reminder of some intimacy releases Augustine into deeper love of God. Augustine's memories of his loves finally help bring his heart home. So let's say that these two scenes in Book 7 and 8 help us think about two ways of conceiving intimacy. We can say, too, that they help us think about two ways of relating love of God and love of created beings. In the first case, intimacy is initially construed as a kind of mind meld shared by two immaterial beings, or by two beings for whom the memories and experiences of incarnate life seem to be more incidental than not. That kind of intimacy shows itself to be unstable. In Book 7, Augustine is reminded that transcendence is not unrelated to the fact of his being ventured upon another, suspended between exposure and expectation. That is to say, Augustine is reminded intimacy, even with God, can't be divorced from vulnerability. In the second case, intimacy takes the form not of a shared mind, but of a shared life, and a familial one at that. Wetzel writes, quote, "Augustine's conversion is not from lust to self-restraint. It is from murky self-preoccupation to the precise tension of a life consciously lived with others." In that life, the truest love of creatures draws Augustine into deeper love and into deeper forms of intimacy with both creatures and Creator. Okay, so Book 4, Love Without Death. So here's the short version of Augustine's discussion of his friend in Book 4. Augustine and his friend are close. You all remember this. The young man was exceedingly dear to Augustine, someone he loved. Augustine tells us he felt as though his friend's soul and his had been but one soul in two bodies, although he writes later this was kind of a frivolous comment. When an unexpected illness takes the young man from this life, Augustine grieves bitterly. After that loss, Augustine tells us everything he sees is hateful and speaks of death. None of his usual sources of pleasure can give him repose. Now, it's not hard to sympathize here with Augustine's pain over his loss and his desperation in seeking relief. We readers of Augustine probably carry losses of our own and have struggled to bear them, especially in the immediate aftermath of parting. So we get it, but Augustine doesn't want us to cut him too much slack. What we might call a normal temporary reaction to the shock of the sudden death of a dear friend, Augustine calls madness and misery. So what exactly is Augustine trying to confess? The two friends are close, but Augustine isn't confessing that he and his friend are too close, as though God is some kind of insecure deity who doesn't want his subjects getting chummy with anyone besides the Almighty himself. The problem is not that Augustine is so busy mooning over his friend that he neglects his prayer life and fails to give God proper due. But there is one line that can tempt us towards that interpretation. Quote, "I was miserable, and miserable too is everyone whose mind is chained by friendship with mortal things, and is torn apart by their loss, and then becomes aware of the misery that it was in even before it lost them." So when I read this with my students, we're often talking about, like, it just sounds like maybe we're just not supposed to love those kind of beings so much at all, or the problem is that he loved his friend rather than God. We might suppose that Augustine's complaint is against the apparent foolishness of ever getting mixed up with mortal beings at all. They're only going to die, and before they die, they are death-bound. We would do better not to give our hearts away to human beings, earthen vessels as they are. Instead, we ought to look for consolation in an immortal God who can supply all our needs. So we see here another version of the temptation Scarrett describes. To think that we need to get close to God by getting over whatever we've loved. In this case, the temptation appeals because it promises to quiet not a sex drive, but a painful grief. But again, the attempt to ascend to God by opting for God over and against creation fails. When Augustine tries to tell his grief-shredded self to trust in God, his disobedient soul refuses, judging the man who was so dear and had been lost to be more real and lovable than the fantasy in which Augustine bid his soul to trust, that fantasy being the disinterested immaterial God of the Manichaean religion. Here, as in Book 7, Augustine tries to do what he imagines to be the right thing and find some comfort or connection in the conception of God on offer, but is delivered from his mistake, his misconception about God, by the memory of an attachment he just can't shake. That is, by the memory of a human being with whom his connection went deeper than that which could apparently be offered by some kind of immaterial God. And students especially, I think it's worth clarifying here. Don't get confused. The Manichaean God is immaterial and false. The Christian God that Augustine has a vision of in Book 7 is immaterial and is in some sense the true God, but Augustine doesn't fully understand who he is. So I just want to make sure that we're not getting confused about what these immaterial gods are. So the Manichaean God's only consoling word would be to tell Augustine that the real goods have survived. There's nothing to grieve. In the immediate aftermath of grief, Augustine may well fear the beauty of the friend escapes God's notice. This kind of God weds beauty to fragility, but then tells Augustine what he took for beauty wasn't beauty at all. This perhaps helps to explain Augustine's obsession with keeping his friend alive, if only in memory. The friend's death left Augustine feeling only half alive, and Augustine feels as though he himself, a beleaguered half-soul, is really all of his friend that continues to survive. He writes, quote, "Perhaps I was so afraid of death because I did not want the whole of him to die, whom I had loved so dearly." As a Manichae, Augustine had been taught that the best things in life, the really perfect things, are untouched by corruption, death, and decay. Death can never really take what matters. But the persistence of light and truth doesn't seem to preserve what Augustine had with his friend, which is why the burden of keeping his friend alive in his own person weighs so heavily on Augustine. Light and truth don't seem to have much of a memory for dead human beings. Augustine had, perhaps unwittingly, sought an intimacy, a friendship that traded on forgetfulness about death. He confesses he had poured out his soul into the sand by loving a man doomed to death as though he were never to die. Death comes as an insuperable interruption to intimacy, for it shows the connection to have been premised on a frailty that could only be tolerated by being forgotten. Thus, Augustine's solution to his grief is, to his shame, forgetfulness. He leaves town and looks for new friends, ones who aren't dead, so he can forget about his need for unbreakable connection that apparently admits of no earthly satisfaction. Augustine can't square the theology in his head, which is that Manichaean voice that tells him to let his intellect pare down his sense of what's really of value, with the grief of his heart, which confronts him with the frailty of what he continues to love. But you all know the Confessions well enough to know that the story I'm telling is so far only half true. It's really not that Augustine had a good thing going with his friend and was wrestling with God's apparent indifference. The whole truth is that Augustine realizes that he was blameworthy in the way he was relating to his friend, too. It's clear the author of the Confessions had that realization, but there are hints the younger Augustine did as well. Perhaps the simplest way to describe the problem is to say that Augustine was confusing intimacy or closeness with sameness. Augustine's friend is one created beauty Augustine thinks he has pretty well under his grasp. He's something of a disciple, learning the Manichaean faith under Augustine's enthusiastic tutelage. Both of them were raised in Christian households. But Augustine is revealed to have misjudged the firmness of his grip on his friend. When the friend takes sick and the decision is made to baptize him without his knowledge, Augustine thinks the whole thing is of little consequence. Quote, "I was unconcerned, for I was confident his soul was more likely to retain what it had received from me, not what had been done to his body while he was unconscious." Augustine thinks his friend's soul is well under his grasp, and he presumes that soul will be more ruled by what Augustine has offered than by some ritual performed on an unconscious body. When the friend awakens and Augustine tries to make light of the whole thing, he is shocked when his friend refuses to join in the fun. With sudden independence, the friend tells Augustine he'd better stop saying such things if he wishes to remain friends. Chalking up the disagreement to the stress of illness, Augustine decides to wait to continue the conversation. He reports his confidence that his influence will win out, and he would ultimately be able to do what he liked with his friend, but this was not to be. The fever flares up again, the friend dies, and Augustine, having given up on his faithful vigil to give his friend some space, was not there. The few days' interval of separation widens into a yawning gap that threatens to be permanent. And part of the loudness of Augustine's grief may have stemmed from a secret worry about whether he had loved as well as he ought. So here then is the whole picture. Augustine can't be consoled by a God, the Manichaean God, who seems to overlook the beauty of the friend who has died. But he also can't be consoled by his own love for the man either. For all his pretense, his love was far from faultless. What Augustine knows for sure is that this friend should not be lost. He can't let go of the friend, not even enough to let his friend have his own opinions about the good of his soul. For he fears that if he lets go, the friend will be utterly lost. Augustine's mature diagnosis in the Confessions is that he failed to love his friend in God. That failure showed up as a theological problem and as a kind of relationship problem. Augustine tells us, his readers, that we can be so obsessed with avoiding death that we overlook how generously life is offered to us, a life that can sustain the intimacy we seek both with those we love and with God. Here is the key to intimacy, the moral Augustine takes from the death of his friend. Quote, "Blessed is he who loves you, and loves his friend in you, and his enemy for your sake. No dear one is lost to him, for whom every dear one is held in the one who is never lost. And who is that one but our God, God who made and who fills heaven and earth? He alone loses no one, no dear one." But what could it possibly mean to love your friend in God? And how exactly does that guarantee against the ultimate loss of those loved ones? It sounds really nice, but it's not exactly clear what he's saying. By way of response to such questions, Augustine offers an analogy between created beauties and syllables. The passing of syllables is what enables speech to be meaningful. So if you hold on to one syllable in a word, your word just ends up being meaningless, right? If you let all the syllables pass, then what you're saying becomes meaningful. This is sort of where the Eliot ties in. Words move only in time. So too, Augustine says, the passing away and succession of created goods together form a whole of which the creatures are parts. That is, there is meaning in them, a meaning not destroyed but revealed in their temporal passing. Quote, "If your fleshly sense were able to comprehend the whole, and had not for your punishment been justly restricted to a part of it, then you would wish that whatever exists in the present would pass on, so that all things might delight you more." It's kind of interesting. First, in that passage, he's talking about the whole. He says, you want the whole. But then in the end, he says, once you get the whole, what happens is that not that the whole delights you more, but that all things, I take it, he's pointing us again to the individuals. All things will delight you, will give you pleasure. To be clear, Augustine's not telling us that we should be glad our friends die because in the master plan it all works out okay. He's not making God out to be some kind of deranged collectivist leader who's ready to sacrifice the individuals for the sake of the whole. In fact, Augustine does not tell us exactly why and how it will make sense to us, indeed be meaningful to us, that we have known temporal parting from those we love. But he does tell us this: the good of an utterance isn't realized without its passing. The true good of a human being isn't destroyed by death. Augustine offers this consolation to the brokenhearted. Christ is intimately present to the human heart. Quote, "Let us love him, for he made these things, and he is not distant. For he did not make them and then abandon them. They are from him and in him. See, he is there wherever truth is savored. He is intimate to the heart, though our hearts wander from truth and from him. Return then to your heart, you wanderers, and cling to him who made you." The created things, the creatures, these fragile beauties that we love, are expressions of who Christ is. And he has not forgotten them. He is close to them, sustaining them and willing that not one will be lost. What is more, Augustine says, the temporal passing of created beauties reflects the very life of Christ himself. He ran. He actually says Christ ran. He ran through this life, shouting by his words, his deeds, his life and his death, his descent into hell, his ascension into heaven, shouting so that we might return to him. And then Augustine says, he withdrew from our sight so that we might return to our hearts and there find him. When we seek for that beloved who appears lost, gone from our sight, Augustine tells us we should look towards our hearts and let our affection for those creatures remind us of Christ's love for them as well. And I want to say here, it's not that we look towards our hearts and Christ is doing what we're doing. We're doing what Christ is doing, right? I just don't want this to sound like he's telling us to look inward and fall in love with ourselves, and God falls in love with that too. So I don't want this to sound self-indulgent. When we look to our hearts, he says, there we find him, not ourselves. But God has not forgotten. And so Augustine, let me start that sentence over. He offers us, we forget, we doubt the fact of our intimacy and our friends' intimacy to Christ. Christ offers us his life, but we fear he has overlooked the fact of death, a fact we let drag us down, hoping that our loyalty to that painful reality will make up for God's apparent forgetfulness. But God has not forgotten, and so Augustine exhorts us. Life has come down to you. Do you not want to ascend and live? Augustine calls us, his readers, to remember what we are. Human, nothing more and nothing less. We're mortal, and we love mortal beauties. And we're tempted to cling to them, to try to preserve them and save them, as though we are the only ones with any stake in the matter. But Christ is intimate to our hearts. He knows our love for them, and he shares it in an even more profound form. So while we look for happiness in a form of stasis or a kind of stability, keeping all beauties present now, or perhaps trying to limit our attachment to only those beauties we think really can stand the test of time, Augustine tells us Christ wants for us to see meaning comes not in what is fixed and rigorous, but in movement. A word passes, but is not lost. Its passing is also its articulation, its way of taking shape. Words move only in time. That means they die, but that movement is also how they reach into the silence. A life passes in time, but is not thereby lost. Augustine invites us to consider what that passing says to us. Can we hear it, he might ask us, as an articulation of Christ the Word? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. So, Book 9, Wisdom and Life. Augustine spent a lot of his life trying to escape his mother. You all can remember what a domineering and faithful presence she is. On one occasion, he ditched her quite literally on the shores of Carthage, the Aeneas to her Dido, slipping away in the night to catch a ship towards Rome and further entanglement with the Manichees. In Book 9, Augustine stands with her on different shores, the Roman port of Ostia, where they summon strength for a great journey that lies ahead. The journey they have in mind is, of course, a trip back to North Africa, but Augustine will once again sail alone after Monica takes sick and dies at Ostia, making a journey of her own. But before those departures, she and Augustine find themselves unexpectedly alone together at a window overlooking a garden. Their conversation there turns out to take place within just a couple weeks of her death. They confer together very intimately, and the subject of their conversation is the eternal life of the saints and what that life must be like. As they speak, they find the pleasures of the senses pale in comparison beside the joy of that which is, and they lift themselves up in longing. They finally transcend even their own minds and touch on that land of never-failing plenty where life is wisdom. Life is wisdom, wisdom is life. That wisdom is eternal being. It does not come into being and then pass away. But it's also not just the wisdom of an immaterial principle. The wisdom of God, this is really crucial, the wisdom of God is that by and through whom all things are made. It is, we might say, the sort of wisdom Augustine can approach in the presence of his mom, which is to say, Augustine shows us here that his birth into time and a body does not hold him back from eternal life. It does not hold him back from knowing God's life. Together, mother and son touch God's wisdom, wisdom that allows both for individuation and intimacy. They find a form of transcendence that turns out to be not identical with, but a fulfillment of the life they have already been living. With a leap of their hearts, son and mother touch that wisdom, the sustaining source of all that is made. Then, sighing and unsatisfied, they return to the murmur of their voices, where words begin and end. The beginning and ending of words is a sign that they are back in the time-bound world. But they long for the day when all transient things are still, not gone, not lost, but listening for him who made them, the Word, the eternal wisdom, who abides above all things. That would be life eternal, that life they glimpse together in their vision, a vision that seems to deepen Monica's longing for passing into that life. So when she dies, a huge sadness fills Augustine's heart. Bereft of her comfort, his soul is wounded, but not this time half dead. Instead, he says this, quote, "It was as though my life was rent apart, for there had been but one life woven out of mine and hers. One life, not one soul, not one disembodied mind, but one life woven from the lives of those two. Nothing reminds you of what a life is quite like the presence of your mom, whose life preceded your own and whose body gave you life, or your child, whose non-existence you lived with for many years, but whose arrival into the world reshapes the landscapes of your heart. The life Monica and Augustine share is the life they and Christ have made. The one life that they share binds them together, allowing them to survive love's embarrassments and failures. It offers hope, too, that death does not mean absolute loss. They aim to live their lives in the life of Christ. In that intimate embrace, they are neither subsumed into each other nor swallowed up in God. Augustine suffers from his sorrow over his mother, first fighting back tears, but ultimately shedding them before God, so that they might become a pillow for his soul. After he sheds tears for the loss of his mother's presence, he sheds a few more for the sake of Monica's soul. He prays for forgiveness for her sins and recalls her need for mercy. Acknowledging her sinfulness and trusting in the merits of Christ is, for Augustine, part of acknowledging that his mother was human and that he, Augustine, could not himself preserve and save her. She is held in the life of Christ, a life that holds them through their partings. Christ's intimate presence to the human heart undergirds and sustains Augustine's intimacy with those he loved. That intimacy between Christ's affections and Augustine's own assures Augustine his mother is not lost. Okay, so the last section is on De Magistro. It's called Words Move. To conclude, I want to turn to one last memorial Augustine writes in honor of one he loved, his beloved son Adeodatus. The dialogue De Magistro, or the teacher, takes place early in Augustine's life, a couple years after their baptisms together in Milan. I want to talk about the dialogue because there Augustine considers the human desire to get a fix on words, to hold them and not let them go. And there, too, he connects that desire with the desire to escape heartbreak and loss. Because the dialogue was written down around the time of the untimely death of Adeodatus, it can be read as a meditation on the question we have been pursuing. What kind of connection do we aspire or should we aspire to enjoy with those we love, those we know will ultimately be lost to us, at least in this life? And how does that aspiration track or fail to track God's own affections? So we don't have time to wade through all the details of the text, though I'm thankful to those of you who have sorted through some of them with me this semester in other contexts. But here's what you need to know in the context of my reflections today. In The Teacher, a work that comes roughly 10 years before the Confessions, Augustine makes a confession of sorts too. It is in one sense a confession about words. It may also be a confession of vulnerability to created beauties. It is a confession of love, and arguably also a confession about the imperfection of that love. The topic of the dialogue is signs and signification, how and why we use words, what language is or should be. Augustine invites his son to imagine that words more or less serve as tools for informing other minds. So here's what I mean. Imagine that the point of words is to basically bridge a gap between my private knowledge and experience and your private knowledge and experience. So if we imagine words function like that, we presuppose a distance between the two of us that only words are able to bridge. It's kind of like we're sliding notes under a locked door, and those notes are the only way that we can really get in touch with each other. So on this picture, when I say something to you, it's because I want you to know something you don't currently know. And I'll just send you some words, and then we'll both know the same thing. If we, with Adeodatus, accept Augustine's account of the motivation for speaking, we will look for words and expressions that signify clearly and without ambiguity. We will try to cement the connection between a sign and what it signifies, imagining that the less flexibility we accord our words, the greater communicative power we will yield. This quickly becomes a weirdly ascetic form of communication, in which the operation of expression is pared down to essentials, among which we do not number history, affect, or love. We may love the person with whom we speak, but that love is at best ancillary to our communication. In this stripped-down version of communication, words are treated as units of meaning, more or less separable from our lives as we live them with others. Meaning looks to be fundamentally indifferent to or disconnected from our particular experiences among created beauties. Now, we may protest that this is a pretty implausible description of how we speak, and Augustine himself actually agrees. But nonetheless, he thinks it's a way we are tempted to take as an ideal, facilitating a rigorous, stripped-down apprehension of meaning. And if, as Wittgenstein tells us, to imagine a language is to imagine a form of life, the teacher is arguably also a meditation on the ways Augustine and we conceive life with others. So let me reframe the temptation in this way. I'm tempted to imagine that what my words serve to facilitate is the hooking up of my mind or your mind with God or with truth. And whether or not this takes place does not depend on any prior affection or intimacy. This picture holds out the promise of a kind of escape. If my words, through a process of divine intervention, enable such a hookup, I'm given some relief from having to deal with this fallen world where words slip, slide, refuse to stay in place, a world where words outstrip my grasp. Yet this is a fantasy world, as Augustine admits. In truth, obsession with perfect meaningfulness can lead to meaninglessness. The more I try to get a fix on my words, the less I find they mean. And my obsession with precision might lead me to overlook just how much I was meaning already, apart from having a perfect grasp on my words. The key to understanding Augustine's point here is this: the fragility of words is tied to the fragility of lives. To see that is to begin to see how a confession about words can also be a confession of love and failures of love. Augustine describes a form of speaking, tempting but ultimately illusory, that might build a connection that is secure, free from the possibilities of misapprehension, but also free from the possibility of loss. If words can put two minds in contact, such a connection can't be sundered, not by life, nor by death, nor by any other created thing. If we could successfully use our words to inform other minds, we would thereby speak in ways that are more than human, making connections that pay no mind to death or the movements of the heart. It's tempting to wish for stable words, words that won't slip out of our grasp, and which can give stable form to the flux of time and bodies. It's tempting to imagine that meaning stands fully apart from human beings, who are frail and subject to death. It's tempting to seek to stabilize our words to rule out heartbreak, but the heart breaks anyway, and the brokenhearted find cold comfort in the skeletal form of intimacy that would strip flesh from spirit so that it can call what's left clean. Adeodatus and Augustine's conversation concludes with a reflection on the greatest teacher of all, Christ, the inner teacher. Is he greatest because he is least ambiguous, least broken and frail, most stable, most obviously secure in his beauty and power? That doesn't appear to be the moral on offer. Christ is the inner teacher, yet as James Wetzel has observed, we can also rightly say that the life shared between parent and child is their teacher. He writes, quote, Augustine and Adeodatus conclude that they do share an inner life together, one that neither of them possesses separately. They call this life their teacher. This is the life that both begins and ends their life's argument, allowing them learning through the hesitations, sometimes terrible, of sin, end quote. That teacher is inner because it is intimate, a network of trust, history, and expectation that bears the meanings they have it at heart to share. Their life is the life of Christ, sacrificed and offered up. They are hidden in Christ, bound together as no more nor less than human beings, their familial loves united with God's own. Augustine confesses he contributed nothing except fault to the making of the boy. Presumably he's thinking of his sin with the boy's mother. When we lose those we love, we may be tormented by anxiety about whether we loved well enough. So you can think back to Augustine's torment over his friend and his torment over his love of Monica, which was certainly far from perfect. Augustine pushes the situation to the extreme. Imagine something that has its source in your corruption. Imagine something which begins in the nothing of sin, but which you love with your whole heart. Even that, God, creator of all things, can bring to life. Even though we may remember the failures that cast shadows around our attempts at loving, God's gratuitous love reforms our deformities. Augustine is reminded that God loves Adeodatus beyond even Augustine's capacity for love. They share that object of affection. And so he, Adeodatus, the dead child, is not lost, neither lost because of Augustine's failure to love purely, nor lost by God's supposed indifference. This is why when Augustine suffers what must surely have been his most grievous loss, the death of his only son, he can remember him without anxiety, writing in Confessions 9, "I have no fear at all for that man." So, can you love a God who lets you lose what you love? Well, it depends on the God, really. For Augustine, the God who weds beauty to fragility is Christ, the one who tells us he is intimately present to the human heart, there with us in our purest and truest affections, and ready to hold those we love when we do not or cannot. Augustine tells us, quote, "The good which you love is ab illo, from him, part of him, belonging to him," end quote. Augustine made all those beauties we hold in our hearts and is even closer to them than we can imagine. It is his heart that holds our more fragile offerings of charity. Augustine knows full well it's not easy to live with the fact that already our hearts are not our own. Sometimes we worry they might shatter, or we suppose God wants children less liable to notice the sheen of created beauties, and so we try to seal up our hearts and make them safe. The fact that we have treasures in earthen vessels may tempt us to think God means to discipline us to accept a more sublime life, one more fixated on eternal principles and less liable to be dragged down by memories of created goods. But our memory pushes back, or rather dilates our hearts into an awareness of how overfull they are and must be. And so Augustine's confessions are not self-flagellation nor self-indulgence. They are confessions of praise for where he tracked God's love and where he did not, and confessions of hope that he and all those he loves, which is to say the whole of God's church and every beauty of God's good creation, will seek and finally know the communion of the Word made flesh. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika. Would you like to take some questions?
I would love to.
Would you like to recognize these?
Sure. Yeah. Ian.
So that was a wonderful talk, and just wanted to thank you for that reminder of what sometimes falls under the heading of Augustine's, a criticism of Augustine's so-called otherworldliness and desire to flee material things, whereas one could make the opposite claim that it's precisely his vulnerability to, as you put it, created goods, created beauties, that makes him all the more attentive to them, even as he tries to work out how to properly order them. I just wanted to draw you out a bit on the question of, so in the context, say, of Book 4, where often the criticism of Augustine is that his grief is, his criticism of his grief is inhumane in a way, that he's not allowing himself to grieve as a human ought to, or that he's being critical of himself to a considerable extent, to the extent that we should allow. You placed it rightly in conversation with the Manichaean God in the debate between the Christian God and the Manichaean God. And your final question, it depends on what God we're talking about. And I'm just wondering, particularly in the conversations around finitude and death, if you would have to change the conversation, or Augustine would have to change the conversation substantially if we were talking about not alternative gods, but no God versus the Christian God. By which I mean, I think one of the discomforts some have with reading that passage is to suggest that Augustine doesn't allow finitude to be precisely that, finitude. That because of his belief in God, or at least his intimations, as he says, he's always believed in divine providence, as a young person and as an older person, that finitude is often swept away into a kind of belief in maybe the immortality of the soul, or the resurrection, and therefore isn't allowed to convey the fullness and the decisiveness of death, which for, I think, both atheists and sort of post-secular humanists, this is precisely the point. This is what needs to be felt. Does the conversation have to change substantially, and how he would reason through that with them?
Yeah. So it's funny, you're right. The criticism is sometimes made, or could be made, well, because he has this story about how everyone gets taken up in God, he doesn't really have to reckon with death. But in fact, I think what he wants to say about himself is he's not reckoning with death at all, he's not taking death seriously, and he's not taking finitude seriously. And how do we know that? Well, because when his friend dies, he says he doesn't really come to terms with his friend's death, he just goes and finds more people who aren't dead and just kind of tries to put it out of his head. I mean, he says this, I went to find more friends and I just sowed the seeds of fresh sorrows because I wasn't really reckoning with the loss. Now, we also have to say something over here about the loss. He's also criticizing himself, like I said, the reason he's not, what's problematic about his grief is that he's not really grieving his friend. He's just grieving what he's lost. So there again is another way that we can say that he's failing to take finitude seriously, because he's not thinking about, the fact that human beings are mortal and that they're going to be lost. All he's really thinking about is the fact that this person who is so dear to him, that he enjoyed so much, is gone and doesn't get to be around him anymore. And I think he thinks when he looks back on it, well, even immediately, in the immediate aftermath, there's a kind of self-indulgence there. So your question is good. It's really good, because the atheists might want to say to us, well, you're failing really to take finitude seriously, and Augustine somehow is saying back to us, no, even as, what is he saying? Even as Christians, perhaps, I think he wants to say, though I'm not sure I can defend it, so I'm hesitating here, but Christians more than anyone else really have to reckon with finitude. So, yeah, the Christianity can let you off the hook, but it really shouldn't. I don't know.
Yeah,
that's not quite it.
I'm puzzling over it myself, so we've had conversations about this already.
Yeah, but what I can say for sure is that Augustine would say, look, I had a God in mind, and I had some sort of sense that what was good was preserved, and I was refusing to really acknowledge the finitude of my friend. I just tried to put it out of my head. Yeah. Yeah, Peter.
I'd also like to thank you for the talk. I would love to hear it again. Maybe others would overrule me or something, but I would love to hear it again just for the chance to think it again.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that, just let you know.
But I found myself kind of paying attention to how you kept bringing up, I suppose I could say something contemplative in nature, in the interest in the words, or
yeah.
I mean, a way way of putting it is the book 7 assent to a kind of something to be apprehended merely by the mind. There's something parallel at these later stages too of wanting of the syllables adding up to something coherent, and we can't have the further thought without the dying of the syllables. And so I just find myself wondering whether there's not something kind of intellectual or contemplative about the whole assent, or is that something that in the end one does need to let go of, and that there's something in the fragility that really is missed by that original, that really has to be let go of. And I'm not quite sure how to put it, except maybe just one further suggestion, that it's not the fragility per se, but the lack of meaning in the fragility that turns out to be the problem. A lack of order in the fragility. But that order is itself not fragile. And so, in the end, there's of course a promise of something that isn't really fragile. I think I will stop. I'll be a syllable that stops talking. But I'm just wondering how that continuity in the assent.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was really interesting, but I'm not sure.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The continuity being that there's something intellectual or contemplative about longing to have the fragile parts come together in a word or something that we can understand, and that is what's longed for, or should be longed for, as we are impatient with our fragility.
Yeah, right. Okay, so let me say this. I think we do want this kind of understanding. And at several points when I was writing this, I was really irritated with myself because I was like, well, why don't you just tell them why people die? Because that's what they're all coming to find out. And I was like, well, I'm probably not going to be able to do that. And Augustine's kind of giving us an explanation why. Well, you can't have this right now, but what you can have is the promise that you will have this. But he thinks, as Christians, you probably already do have some sense that at some point everything will make sense and, that everything will be redeemed. What I think he gets us that we might not have noticed is that this articulation of the word is happening right now, and it's unfolding in time. So I think when we imagine the redemption or the final articulation, there's this temptation to say, aha, well, that's going to be then, and it's going to be, when all these words are gone and have passed into nothingness, and that's going to be Christ, the real word. But Augustine's trying to say, well, don't forget that there's some kind of connection between the words that are unfolding right now and Christ, the word. There's not a strict identity, but the relation is, this is the body of Christ and this is Christ, and so figure out that kind of relation. So you're asking about the workings of intellect. I don't know, does that help at all?
It's helpful, and I apologize for not having a sharper point to the question. I guess maybe a way of putting it is just, it sounded in a sense as surprisingly philosophic, that what we long is for the fragile, broken syllables to come together in a meaningful string that we can understand eventually. Is that right, or is that not right because there's something even more in the fragility that we ultimately are longing for, and that's in a sense the whole point of your talk, and we can't stay too philosophic, and appreciate that.
I think I just don't know the answer to your question, and I I'm a little nervous about glorifying fragility and glorifying the passing, because what Augustine wants to say is this really hurts. But there must be some deep mystery to the fragility, because it was a part of the human experience that even Christ entered into. So the fragility isn't just a sign of fallenness. So it's not just, we have to deal with passing and fragility, but that's something that's totally separate from the divine. No, in fact, it's something that Christ enters into, and we pass, and Christ passed, though he was running. He was running through life, anxious to get to the end, so that the whole could be revealed. But the entering into the fragility of life doesn't just seem to be instrumental. It seems to be, Augustine's telling us, this is part of the life of Christ. This is part of the life of God. If you want to know who God is, you need to look at Christ. So, yeah, Father Allen.
I think in some ways you're talking about sacrament.
Mm-hmm.
And that Augustine's imagination of that which is seen pushes him to that which he cannot see.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't want those two things to come apart.
Mm-hmm.
So this vulnerability, this love of created beauty, where one can stop with the sign and forget what's behind it.
Right.
Is that not?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And on the one hand, you think, well, how could we miss that? And then on the other hand, you think, well, when you have a dead child, a dead mother, a dead friend, it's a reminder that you need. And so I really think he's trying to offer us, he's not necessarily telling us something that's never occurred to us before, but he's reminding us, you need to keep this in mind as you grieve those that you love. Don't get stuck on the signs. See what's being said. See what God is saying to you through them.
Inner teacher.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks. Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to say something quick in response to Ian's question about atheism.
Yeah.
I mean, if the presupposition of the question is that the atheists are more serious about finitude than believers in Christ.
Yeah.
I think you get the odd idea of like, well, the way I deal with my finitude is I'll come to some sort of theoretical apprehension of the universe. In this case, it doesn't include God. And I think this is actually what Augustine resists, not by adding another theory, but by confessing the way in which it was impossible for him to step outside the life that he was given.
Mm-hmm.
And as he comes to that realization, he begins to learn something. But I think, and actually, Peter is connected to what you're saying as well. I mean, there's always going to be a temptation to think there's some theoretical point of view from which everything makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
There's no counter point of view to that. There's only a light that is felt either to be shared or not shared by God.
Mm-hmm. And this is why you write a confession and not a treatise. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Phil.
You were mentioning the grief for a friend, for a son, and for a mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the pattern, it seems to me. I mean, you've got the grief for the friend in book 4, the grief for his mother in book 9. The grief for his son is remarkable because he doesn't speak it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Augustine the bishop, writing Confessions book 9, says, I have no anxieties for him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, fine. But what happened when he died?
Mm-hmm.
We just don't hear, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any notion of why he chose not to tell us what his grief was like at the
No, and so one thing that I've been doing is trying to suggest that, well, since what Augustine gives us one memory of his son, and that's in De Magistro. And so I think, well, he's clearly not writing explicitly about his grief there. We don't know for sure that it was written down before the son died. But it seems to me, I mean, that's where I've been going to try to get some sense of what his son meant to him, and also to try to think about his grief over his son. But aside from that, I don't know. I mean, it's not difficult to imagine that he couldn't write about this thing, but yeah, there's just not a lot of text to work with. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm struck at the end
Yeah.
of De Magistro, where one of the lessons that Augustine teaches his son is that you have one teacher and he's in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Mimicking the passage in Scripture, you have one father and he's in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a father teaching his son that you have one father in heaven and one teacher. There seems to be a kind of renunciation there. I've always read that as if probably Augustine's writing after the death of his son.
Yeah.
And giving him up.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, we were talking about this. I was talking about this with some folks from humanities. I mean, it may be that that's actually why. So what Augustine tells us is that every word that's spoken there was spoken by Adeodatus. Every word that Adeodatus says in the dialogue was really spoken by Adeodatus. But it may be that the reason there's that sort of tying up at the end is that Adeodatus was already gone, and Augustine decided, well, I'm going to sort of fill in some things and tie it off. Right, so I know that you think that this is a gesture of renunciation. And I think we just have to be careful about what we mean by that. So what I don't want to say is that Augustine is saying to Adeodatus, hey, don't look to me, I'm not your father, look to God in heaven, right? And I don't think this is what you mean. What Augustine is suggesting to us is that, or what I was trying to suggest in the whole talk, is that our love for these created beauties, rightly understood, is our love for God. And our human loves, when rightly understood, are our love for God. They become our love for God. So yeah, he's giving his son to God, but that doesn't mean that he's saying, I'm not your father, right? So, yeah.
More questions?
All right.
Thank you, Erika.
Thank you all for coming.